Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Cardassians, which is episode 5 of season 2 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the second season episode Cardassians. So Cardassians is the episode in which they discover a Cardassian orphan who's raised by Bajoran parents on the station. The allegations are made that they are abusive to the parents, so Gul Dukat gets involved and wants to separate this Cardassian child from the Bajoran parents, and then a legal hearing ensues. Meanwhile, Garak teams up with Bashir to investigate the situation because Garak finds it awfully strange that Dukat is interested in such a minor thing like this. Eventually, they uncover that the Cardassian boy in question is in fact not an orphan and is the long-lost son of a prominent civilian leader who is the political rival of Dukat. And so Garak and Bashir do some more investigating and discover that Dukat purposely had the son whisked away to a Bajoran orphanage so that he could humiliate the politician, and Dukat leaves when he is in protest, when he is exposed to this, and so his plot is laid bare and a political stalemate exists between the civilian leader and Dukat, where neither of their careers will be ruined, and Sisko decides to return the orphan boy who wants to live with his Bajoran parents and hates Cardassians. Sisko decides to return him to his Cardassian father. So, I never really thought much about this episode. I mean, even when it first came out. Not that I didn't like it. I thought it was fine. It was fine and dandy. It just didn't really strike me as particularly interesting or engaging, I should say. And I was interested in an episode about Cardassians because, as I mentioned before, I was really into the Cardassians ever since they were first introduced in The Wounded, and I was glad to see more of them. However, I mean, this episode did explore some of their culture a little bit, but it's not really the type of episode that I really wanted to see with them. But looking back on this episode in retrospect, I see that it really set the stage for many things in the show having to do with the Cardassians. For one thing, it brought back Garak, whom we hadn't seen since the second episode of the show. What's it called? Not Invasive Procedures, not Preemptive Strike. It was past prologue. There we are. So we hadn't seen Garak, and Garak is actually very different in this episode, where he was a bit goofy and over the top and plain and simple, where they do make references to the plain simple thing, but his attitude is something more along the lines of what his character will become. So they really defined his character here. And plus, after his brief appearance and, all the way back in the second episode of the show, they could have just forgotten about Garak and could have just quietly retconned him off the show, which, they've done with characters before, but they didn't. They decided to bring him back with this episode, and that was a very important step. Plus, you get the Garak and Bashir dynamic. For one, the holy cats. For one thing, they did make it so they wouldn't let Andrew Robinson play it as if he had a crush on Bashir. That was nixed. But the relationship definitely was evolved in this episode, and I love how it began this way. So it was implying that they continued having lunch together this whole time and that the relationship evolved off screen, but actually to see it and it was actually like a really good dynamic. It's showing how much better season 2 is than season 1, that it's sort of, their relationship comes off like much better in this episode than it did back in season 1. And of course, as we know, it will evolve and become a running thing throughout the show. So this episode is very noted for introducing that. It's also very notable for bringing back another famous Cardassian, Gul Dukat, or should I say infamous. He was featured briefly in the pilot episode, Emissary, and then he was a face on the screen for both Duet and I believe Homecoming. He appeared very briefly in both of those episodes, but this is the first time they really brought him back in any meaningful way. And again, so it's the beginning of making him the main villain, the main antagonist of the show. And I'm still surprised that some people try to play it off like he's not a villain. He 100% is, always has been. He was in charge of the freaking Bajoran occupation. And yes, no. I'm not going to get down that rabbit hole in this review. Maybe I'll get to that later. But he has always been despicable and a despicable villain. But that's another topic. But the point is like, the other thing I noticed about Dukat is, and this, I remember noticing this when I first saw this episode, is that his makeup is very different. And it's the same, I talked about this in the season premiere of season 2, how a lot of the characters' makeup had evolved in between seasons. Odo in particular was the most notable one. Resembles more of what Odo will look like going forward, and same with Dukat. Like before this, people might not realize he looked a bit more like a Golmasset from The Wounded. It was a bit more flat and a bit more beige or tan. Where in this episode, it's a lot more pronounced, like all the Cardassian features, and it's definitely more gray. And so yeah. And it looks so much better. He looks so much like stronger and imposing with this new makeup in this episode. And this, of course, would be his look going forward as well. Now, with Dukat's storyline in this episode, he is obviously playing at this political game to try to get at his rival. I heard this opinion that maybe he was being sincere in wanting to help the orphans. I'm like, boy, do I have a bridge to sell you if you believe that. Of course he's not being sincere. And I think they're making that very obvious, that when he feigns concern over the orphans, he is completely full of shit. Garak would even say as much. Like, this is not something that's would be that big of a deal. For the Cardassians, they don't really care about this. He's just using it as a way to strike back at his political enemies. In fact, he is directly responsible. And that's the other thing I heard people say, oh, he probably wasn't responsible for Rugal being taken away from his parents and put in the orphanage. That might have been someone else doing that to make him look guilty. I'm like, no. Again, I have a bridge to sell you if you believe that. Very clearly he was responsible for this. Very clearly. And just the way that he was like pissed off with Bashir for exposing him for this was great. It was a very great moment. And yeah, and the whole thing was about Dukat, how he's a slimy politician. Oh, I just want to help the children. He doesn't give a fuck about the children. He's attacking his political enemies. And I love that. I love that about his character. Mark Alimo plays this character amazingly well. Yeah, and so that's definitely the Garak and Dukat thing. Definitely a highlight of the episode. And also, by the way, this is the first time we hear mention of the feud between Garak and Dukat. And I love it how Bashir like insinuated that Dukat was like friends with Garak, said he was really concerned for you, and Garak just started laughing like hysterically because he knows they're blood enemies. And again, when Bashir goes to Dukat and says, and Dukat's like, who told you that? He's like, your old friend, Garak. And he's like, well, you might tell my old friend, Garak. And then when the two of them actually come face to face during the hearing towards the end of the episode, like the look Dukat gives Garak right before he walks out speaks volumes. Absolutely amazing. Both these actors are amazing. Now, the episode ends with Bashir asking Garak about what exactly exists between Garak and Dukat. And Garak does some, one of his classic lines is like, oh, the truth is just an excuse for lack of imagination. No, maybe that's what he says later on. He says something here that he doesn't believe in truth because there is no truth, just the plain, simple cloth or whatever. Would you guys knock it off? Jesus Christ, sorry. So where was I? So Garak wouldn't tell Bashir what the deal with him and Dukat is. He's like, but the clues are spread out like breadcrumbs on this table or whatever. But it actually is revealed, at least partly revealed, later on in the third season episode, Civil Defense, when we see Dukat and Garak together again, where Dukat brings up directly the fact that Garak prosecuted his father, and his father was found guilty at the trial. I think for treason, I believe the crime was. We don't know the specifics, and we don't know the specifics of the feud between Garak and Dukat. We don't know if the feud started there or it was already pre-existing, or if that's when Dukat started to think of Garak as a blood enemy because he was responsible for his father's arrest. So we do know that much. So we do learn about more about their feud, but it's not really touched on that much after that episode, unfortunately. But yeah, that's always a fascinating thing. Another first for this episode is the first time that Terok Nor, the name Terok Nor, is mentioned. That we know that Deep Space Nine used to be called Terok Nor when it was under Cardassian occupation. This will be referenced repeatedly throughout the rest of the show. I will actually get a couple episodes when we even go back to Terok Nor during this occupation. One, in fact, is coming up later on in season 2. I don't know what they're doing, but anyway, yeah. So that's very interesting that we get these tidbits that sort of set the stage. So the episode, even though I don't think it's that fascinating, is very important for those kind of things. Now, I do like Bashir's role that he plays in this episode as well. I think this is a good episode for developing his character. They definitely are working on him, making him much more interesting in season 2 than he was in season 1. They still play him off as a bit naive and arrogant, but it's better. Like, he's not nowhere near as annoying as he was in season 1, and he's a lot more interesting. I do love the scenes, like his interaction with Cisco when he interrupts Cisco's meeting with Dukat and asks Dukat direct questions. And then Cisco is like, oh, so you thought because Garak insinuated something that might mean this, you thought it was necessary to go interrupt my meeting. And he was like, oh, I'm sorry, sir. He's like, no, don't apologize. It was the highlight of my day. Don't do it again. That was such an amazing... God, I love this. It's not even overacting. It's just so good. I actually loved the way that Avery Brooks played that. And then later on, when Garak wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, we need to go to Bashir, and so Bashir wakes up Cisco and is like, oh, can I have a runabout? And and he's like, what? I'm waiting, doctor. Tell me why. It's like, well, Garak woke me up and said it was very important. He's like, oh, is one runabout good enough, or would you like two? That is really good stuff. But then, of course, Dukat calls him at the exact same time. Says, "Oh, we found out that the father is actually this, civilian leader." And Sisko's like, "Well, that Bashir points out that can be a coincidence that Garak woke me up at the exact same time." And Sisko's like, "Well, there's only one way to find out." So I actually gave him the permission to use the runabout, which is great. And also, again, the interaction between Bashir and Garak was also amazing in this episode. How Bashir Garak kind of plays along with Bashir, kind of treats him as, he's playing like 3-dimensional chess, and Bashir is like playing 2D checkers. Like he's like seems to be like 2 or 3 steps ahead of Bashir, and kind of what's what I'm looking for? Patronizes him a bit. And then so after they go to the orphanage and they're on their way back, Bashir is like turns off the runabout and stops. It's like, we're not going anywhere until you tell me what the hell is going on. I love it when he first turns off the runabout. Garak's like, you're upset. So after he does that, though, Garak is like, tries to baby walk him through exactly what's going on. And when Bashir starts to catch on, again, he's very like snide and like patronizing. It was like, very good, Doctor. Did you figure this one all out by yourself? Like kind of, oh, now you're finally able to put 2 and 2 together. Good for you. Like the way he was, it was very venomous. The way he was kind of like sort of striking back at Bashir for like stopping him and being like kind of toying with him and being like, well, you're just too stupid to figure this out, so I gotta walk you through it. Which is kind of symbolic of what the relationship is like. Now it will get better though going forward. Bashir will kind of not be such on the losing side. He will sort of be able to keep up a bit more with Garak, particularly in later seasons, but that will begin towards the end of this season. But yeah, it's definitely a good place to start. Now, getting into the storyline with the orphan. I guess this is the part I didn't really find all that interesting. It is kind of tragic, and it does make sense that something tragic like this happens. And it's interesting we learn that it's Cardassian culture that children without families are kind of pariahs and kind of meaningless, and so that's part of the reason why they didn't give a shit about the orphans and just abandoned them. And you have that one scene where Garak's at the orphanage and the Cardassian children come out and says, have you come back to take us to Cardassia? It's funny because I've watched several reviews, and when they quote that line, they say it with a British accent. She doesn't have a British accent. They're probably thinking of like Oliver Twist or something. Please, sir, can I have some more? But anyway, that was heartbreaking. And you could tell that Garak was actually moved by this. And I believe that Andrew Robinson even talked about this. Like, that's how he played it. Like, he was confronted with the flaws of his culture. And I love it when he was explaining it to Bashir. He, explaining that, children without parents have no standing in Cardassian society. It's like, I don't make the rules. That's just the way things are. He's like, but you do play the game. But I think in that moment, though, he was definitely faced with the realities and felt guilty over it. And plus, it's interesting contrasting the children that Garak encounters at the orphanage to Rugal, because Rugal obviously likes being Bajoran. He's raised as Bajoran. He loves his Bajoran parents. He wants to remain on Bajoran. He thinks of himself as a Bajoran. Whereas these Cardassian kids who are at the orphanage obviously were not being loved and cared for as much, and they never found that kind of family that Rugal had, and so they just want to go back to Cardassia. And it kind of implies that they're not being treated the best at the orphanage and not looked after with love, because they're just like begging, can you please take us back to Cardassia? I know that's not what she says. She says, are you here to take me back to Cardassia? But still, that's implied. That's what they're saying. So that's actually very, very interesting. Also, by the way, I love that time when when the person at the orphanage turns to and stares at Garak and is like, "I wasn't here 8 years ago. I was in the Resistance," and obviously she was shooting that at Garak, and he's like, "Really? Perhaps we have met." It's just that sort of that facade he has of being friendly, but obviously he's being sort of vicious back. Garak is so great, and he'll only get better. But anyway, so the whole thing with Rugal, I don't know. I didn't find all. I mean, it's kind of interesting, but that he definitely was raised by Bajorans, and one thinks of himself as Bajorans and hate Cardassians, and the way he bit Garak, which is an overreaction, but Garak came over and what a handsome young man, and puts his arm on his shoulder. You shouldn't do that. A stranger shouldn't, older man shouldn't go up to a kid and just put your arm on, touch their shoulder and be like, what a handsome young man. That's creepy. But biting his hand is overreacting. But it's interesting because he's an orphan as far as they know, that was abandoned by his own people. And so on one end, and his Bajoran parents obviously love him and shelter him and give him love and care. And so that's makes you reconsider, if you should stay with them. But the whole thing with that's the downside of that is they taught him to hate Cardassians. They taught him about the occupation, and the way his father says it is, I'm not going to lie to him. I'm going to be honest about what the Cardassians did to the Bajorans, and apparently he learned in school also, is all the school he's going to is also teaching him on how terrible the Cardassians are. And again, you got to think that he has a point when he says, I'm not going to lie, that they're being honest about the facts of what the Cardassians did to them. But you also got to think that they're putting their own little bigotry spin on it. They're not just teaching him flat out objective facts. They're definitely lacing those facts with prejudice, with Cardassian, the way he says, you're a butcher. It's obviously he's learning that just for being a Cardassian. And so in that way, even if it's just on a subconscious level, Rugal is grown up being sort of self-loathing. Now, getting into the accusation that the merchant guy who was playing Dabo, that he made about his Rugal's parents being abusive to him, I had an epiphany while watching this episode yesterday, that I never realized before. It never occurred to me, but I guess I start to realize things when I really, sit down and try to analyze the episode as much as possible. I still could be wrong, but I very strongly believe, and I would argue very firmly, that that guy is flat out lying when he says that. And further, I think that he was paid by Dukat to say that. In fact, Dukat probably planted him there because he talked about how, Rugal's father was looking for work, and so I helped him out. That wasn't a coincidence. I think Dukat paid him to go help him out, paid him to get close to the family so that he could lie. And it's very subtle. They never outright say this, but I think there's clues. The biggest clue to me is the fact that, and this again is just mentioned very briefly in a line of dialogue, so blink and you'll miss it, or not listening or whatever, just very briefly mentioned, so it's very subtle. When Dukat brought up, how could you even think about returning the boy to his abusive parents? Sisko says, it was just one guy who made those accusations, and we can't even find him. So after he tells Bashir, and he's acting like any good con man will act like he doesn't want. Like he was acting like he doesn't want to tell Bashir, but then he was very forthcoming with Bashir. It's like, oh, they were so abusive and blah blah blah. But the interesting thing, again, that brief line of dialogue, if you pay attention, he disappeared after making that accusation. You can't find him again. He's supposed to be having a long-term relationship with Rugal's father and continuing to work with him in certain manners, but now, all of a sudden, after he made those accusations, poof. Now, you could argue that, well, obviously he's not going to stay with, and work with Rugal's father after he knows the accusations he just made, because that would put a rift between them, but he wouldn't disappear entirely. He was still, there's no reason for him to leave Bashir and DS9 altogether. So for me, it was obvious that his work was done, that he was hired by Dukat to smear him, and then once he did his thing, he would leave. And then the fact that he wasn't there to back up these allegations just left that, tinge of doubt in the air. I mean, it's his allegations that got Sisko to separate Rugal from his father and given them to the O'Briens. Without that accusation, Sisko would have never done that. So, and also further, I would say, that I think is very obvious from the interactions between Rugal and his father, and everything that they say sincerely, where they sound very honest, that's total bullshit. That Rugal's father is not at all abusive, and in fact very loving. Now, you could say the fact that he teaches him to hate Cardassians and such subconsciously hates himself, but I don't think that's intentional. I think his father really does love him. That's kind of just a fucked up side effect, but he doesn't look, he even says, I don't think of him as a Cardassian. I think of him as a Bajoran, and I think he was being 100% honest in that moment, and that he was like, and that he does think of Rugal as his own son. And I think that's very clear. So I think the accusations that guy made about, oh, they're being abusive, was total bullshit. And the guy was purposely lying through his teeth. And Sisko even points out how they have nothing to back up those allegations. It was just there to plant the seed of doubt so that Dukat could make his play, so that they could make a bigger deal out of it, so that they could uncover that this was actually the son of Podar, or whatever his name is, the civilian leader. And that's that's Dukat's whole game. His whole game was to humiliate the civilian leader, and he was just using him as a tool. And so it makes perfect sense that he would hire that merchant to further this goal, to stoke this and make a bigger deal out of this, make it a bigger sort of big to do. Now, it is kind of a coincidence, though, that Rugal just happens to bite Garak's hand. I mean, because that's what started this whole thing. So what would have Dukat done? Like, what was his end game? And this seems like it's kind of, far-fetched for a long con that he would really plan, steal this civilian's leader's son away from him 8 years ago before they were really enemies. Because what they made clear is that they became enemies because the civilian government is the one that withdrew from Bashir, and Dukat hated that. He lost his big position as leader, prefect of Bashir, which was a huge deal, and so he was very upset over that. And so it's kind of a coincidence. He just so happened to already have this whole thing in play, but whatever. But no, yeah, so that was very interesting, that whole thing. Now, the thing with Rugal, when they had the scenes with him with the O'Briens, there's been other examples in Trek where they have the characters being really obtuse and acting kind of dumb, and in this case where Keiko was acting like, oh, here's some Cardassian food I made for you, like when you know goddamn well He was raised by Bajorans on Bajor and thinks of himself as a Bajoran. Why in the fuck are you going to give him... It's not just that they gave him Cardassian food. On top of that, they keep saying, like O'Brien was, when the kid was like, oh, I want to go home. And Brian's like, yeah, of course you do. You should be with other Cardassians. He's like, no, home to Bajor. I'm like, fucking duh, O'Brien. What big of an idiot are you? And Keiko is being an idiot too and giving them Cardassian food and being like, oh, this is you know, and she was acting this way like he was a typical Cardassian, not like... This should fucking be obvious to anyone that he didn't, you know, he doesn't think of himself as Cardassians. Further, he hates Cardassians, and that's why he pushed the food away. Now, I love this episode also touches on O'Brien's bigotry as it was established in The Wounded, and kind of furthers that. Because I talked about in my review for The Wounded how O'Brien was obviously being bigoted toward Cardassians and acting like he wasn't. Like he wasn't self-aware that he was. It's like, oh, I like the Cardassians, fine. I don't understand why anyone would be mean to them. And then when Cardassian asks him to go to 10 Forward for a drink, he's like, who I spend my free time with is none of your goddamn business. He yells at him. It's like, you're the bigot, O'Brien. And they're consistent. They play that off where he seems unaware of his bigotry when he makes a very bigoted comment about, oh, you know, kindness was bred out of these Cardis years ago. I don't think he said Cardis, but still, it was a very bigoted statement. I love Keiko calls him out on this. She didn't call him out before. She's like, that was a very ugly thing you just said. He's like, what? I just said, he's like, I don't need to hear it again. So that was great. I did love that, although Keiko is still kind of dumb for giving him Cardassian food. I mean, if she gave him Cardassian food, it's like, oh, maybe you'd like to try this. This is what they eat on Cardassia. Maybe you should give this a shot. But she was cooking it as if, oh, this is what you would eat normally. No, he's fucking lives on Bajor. You should cook him Bajoran food. Anyway, and so that obtuseness kind of annoyed me, but it's also, O'Brien did catch on eventually when he met Rugal's Cardassian father and told him, like, well, the boy hates being Cardassian, sort of warned him about it. Now, what's interesting about this ending, and I think it's this ending that kind of gets me, is that Sisko decides to send Rugal back to Cardassia, which is completely the wrong decision. It's kind of I brought this up in the TNG episode Suddenly Human, because in that episode they found a human boy with these aliens who took him during a war and raised him as one of their own, and they tried to return him to his human parents, and he stabbed Picard because he didn't want to go back and he loved his alien father. So eventually Picard did the right thing and returned him to his alien father against orders, because it was an admiral who was his birth mother and wanted him back. But they make the totally opposite and, dare I say, wrong decision in this episode where Sisko decides to give him to his Cardassian father, saying, oh, he never should have been taken away from him in the first place. It was just a part of a dastardly plot from Dukat. Yeah, but that hardly matters. I think what matters more is the fact that he doesn't want to go back, that he hates Cardassians, and sending him to Cardassia with people he hates is not going to fucking end well. And I talked before, I think I mentioned other times I talked about this episode on my channel, that I would bet anything that he committed suicide shortly after. Like, I remember while I was watching this episode yesterday, I was thinking, oh, you know, I wonder what happened to Rugal once, you know, Dominion started destroying Cardassia and leveling cities. I wonder if he survived that. But then I was like, oh, silly me, what the hell am I thinking? He didn't live that long. He committed suicide long before that happened. Like, this just so likely. Now, apparently there's a non-canon novel that tells the story of what happens to Rugal after this episode, and I doubt in that novel he commits suicide. But I don't care about non-canon novels. I think realistically the most likely thing is that he would commit suicide because he despises Cardassians, and you're forcing him to go back to Cardassia to live with a father who is rather despicable, to be honest. Like, especially the way that Sisko, when he's like telling Sisko about, oh, thank you saved my career, and oh, my career is saved, that's all I really care about. Who cares about this? My actual son, oh, my career is saved. Isn't that so great? And thank you for saving it. And Sisko's like, well, maybe you can use your new position to help all the, other orphan children on Bashir. And he's like, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll see. Obviously, he's not going to do it. Obviously, he's full of shit. So, fuck that guy. All he cares about is his own goddamn career. He's no better than Dukat. He just so happened to be on the losing end of their little game. So, yeah, he's a shitty guy. You're forcing Rugal to go back. He despises him. He despises everything Cardassian, and you're forced. There's no way he doesn't commit suicide in a couple months. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to throw some cold water of reality on this episode, but that's the truth. Why the fuck did Sisko force him to go back? That was absolutely 100. I don't care what kind of plot it was. And that was a scheme from a political rival that separated him from his father in the first place. The fact of the matter is, he is now Bajoran. He is now raised by Bajoran. He loves his Bajoran parents, who clearly care for him and have been caring for him. And the allegations of them being abusive were obviously false. The very obvious, clear decision to make here, which was made very clear in the episode Suddenly Human, is to return him to his adoptive Bajoran parents who love and care for him. It's the only way he would ever have a happy life. I'm 100% convinced that he committed suicide shortly after this episode. Sisko made the wrong decision. Anyway, so I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on a Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with this channel. I'd like to give a big special thanks to Antarius and Brandon Neil House. Thank you both so very, very much for your strong support. I would also like to give a shout out to Benjamin Mead, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Megalacio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, Cardassians, more like smart-assians. You know what? I remember this episode well. I felt really bad for the Cardassian dad because he just wanted to be with his son. It really made me want to call my dad and tell him he's cool. I know I'm usually out here with the silly jokes, but this episode hit me in the feels. For some reason, this father-son stuff hit me harder than The Visitor or Family or any of the other feels episodes. I know it's not a good one in the I don't know why it hit me so hard, but it did. I felt more emotional than the Borg Queen felt when she said Janeway. I thought you weren't gonna joke. But anyway, well, you admit this episode's not as good as The Visitor or Family, because it's not. But anyway, I do like Smartassians. That's a good one. It's better than Cardassians. But anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, Andrew Robinson may have got a good performance out of Alexander Siddig as he raised his acting in this episode. Either Andrew Robinson gave him acting lessons, or he may have refused to work with him unless his acting improved. Praka tells Sisko that he told Rugal the truth about the occupation, which he probably did, but he went too far. Sorry to say, Mr. Praka, but all Cardassians aren't brutal killers. I guess he still has hate for the Cardassians, as the occupation was just over about a year ago from now. So it can be understandable for Kaltan Padar as well. However, for Miles O'Brien, there's absolutely no excuse for him. He was disgusted that Keiko allowed Rugal to play with Molly. I like Miles O'Brien as a character, as he's Irish. I hate his portrayal of Cardassian people in general. When he got to know Rugal, his racist mind left him. Maybe talking to Rugal and Kotan Padar slowly was changing his mind about Cardassians in general. I know the episode that he was accused of being a Maquis. That may be the only one that his hatred surface. I will keep an eye out for any other episodes. The scene that almost broke me when the young Cardassian girl asked Garak, "Are you here to bring us home?" It was very heartbreaking to watch. Gul Dukat is really a heartless bastard. To have a child taken away from his dad and use him for leverage in the future is 100% disgusting. So my rating is 9. I would have liked a scene with Rugal and Jake and Garak saying about Rugal, "What a handsome young man." Was he still paying Garak guy, or does he was he still playing Garak gay, or does he like young Cardassians out of 10? I don't think it was meant to be creepy. I think that's just I don't know. I think it's just came off that way because it wasn't necessarily written well because they needed to get the plot going. But I don't think it was meant to imply that he was a pedo or anything like that. Now, yes, you do make a... I don't think that Alexander Siddig's acting was that bad before this episode. I mean, there was that, The Passenger, where his performance was god-awful, but his performance wasn't that bad in other cases. It was more the writing. I think it's the writing got better, and it's a similar thing I talk about with people like Marita Sirtis and Gates McFadden, is that when the writing is better, their acting is better as well. So, I think it's... Yeah, and plus I don't think Andrew Robinson refused to work with him unless his acting got better. I just think that he grew as an actor between seasons, because I definitely has been seeing that so far in season 2 overall. Maybe he did take more lessons. I don't know. But yeah, Gul Dukat definitely is a heartless bastard. 100%. Anyway. Next comment is from Benjamin Mead, who says, this is an episode from Season 2 that has some really high points, but I feel conflicted about the ending of the episode. It really comments the Bashir and Garak relationship, and the scenes where Bashir gets to confront Dukat are good. I think the op scene where Bashir interrupts Sisko and Dukat is pretty funny. Sisko's line of, "It was the high point of my day. Don't do it again," is a good line. I'm not sure I agree with the final decision to return the boy to Cardassia. It seems more complicated than a black and white either or option. Rugal is supposed to be 12 years old apparently, and to me that's old enough to have some input on where you want to go. Some sort of joint custody agreement seems like it might have worked best, although the logistics of something like this might be impractical. The best part of the episode is getting the first glimpses of what a great character Garak will become. Yeah, it's funny because in the episode Suddenly Human, I wasn't totally on board with Picard's decision to return Jeremiah or Jono to the Talarians. I actually suggested a joint custody situation where, mainly like the Talarians could have main custody of him, but he should be allowed to discover his humanity and visit his human parents and stuff like that from time to time. So it wouldn't exactly be a joint custody. It would be more of a sort of, especially, be honest, like in that episode, Jeremiah seemed much more interested in, connecting to his human roots than fucking Rugal is, and connecting with Cardassian roots in this episode. So I think a joint custody situation actually makes a lot more sense than Suddenly Human. But I can see that happening here, but not like a true joint custody. But again, if he goes back to Bajor and lives with the Bajoran parents, but it's a condition that he has to like visit Cardassia every once in a while, or that his father, his real father, gets to visit him on Bajor every once, some sort of such visitation rights thing, like a divorced dad seeing his children on the weekend. Granted, it wouldn't be able to be the weekends because impracticality of being on a whole different fucking planet, but along those lines where his primary parents are still his Bajoran parents, I think that would have been a much better situation. But honestly, I think the joint custody thing actually would have worked better in Suddenly Human. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, This episode is strong in further developing Bashir and Garak's friendship and working together, which for the naive, fresh-faced Starfleet that Bashir has been definitely puts him in a neat place as he learns through Garak the nasty politics of the Cardassians, which includes children. I also like the role O'Brien had, being the temporary guardian of a child of an enemy, and a reminder if his role in the Cardassian War would rather forget. The first seeds of Garak and Dukat's differences is also intriguing, but the elephant in the room is the resolution. If anyone wants to talk about Picard's controversial solution of sending the human back to the species due to culture shock, but also misogyny in Suddenly Human, this Cardassian kid, who mainly only knows Bajoran culture and loves his parents and sees the Cardassians as a brutal enemy, which they were to the Bajorans, and sent back to his father, seems brutal. And it is this episode that convinces me, wow, maybe Picard did the right thing in Suddenly Human. Still, this is a rich story that does explore Cardassian culture, and it is why I give it 8 Yamek sauces out of 10. Good old Yamek sauce. Did I mention Yamek sauce again in this episode? I missed it if they did. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, We haven't seen Garak for a long time compared to his later, more frequent appearances. It's great to see him and Gul Dukat back. Both are always great guest characters. It really would be interesting to know how the news reaches Gul Dukat so fast. With all we know now, I can't imagine Garak calling him, but I don't know how much of Garak's backstory was invented at this point. In the scene in the O'Brien's quarters, Miles is setting the table with plates. I'm wondering, do they replicate a bowl of food and then wash the plates and reuse them? Do they have a dishwasher or a kitchen sink in their quarters? And what happens to the glasses and cups in general, which are constantly replicated? You never see if and how they are recycled. So the replicator technology is not well thought out in all aspects. You see, this is especially later in Voyager when Janeway is cooking and apparently using the replicator as an oven, which of course makes no sense at all. Besides that, O'Brien's prejudices against Cardassians are clearly established, but I can't believe they go as far as his first reaction to the kids staying with them. The scene when everyone is gathered and Bashir is asking questions reminded me strongly of old crime movies when the murder is identified by the investigator. The story was exciting and interesting and featured some great character moments, although parts of the idea were borrowed from the TNG episode Suddenly Human. My rating is an 8 out of 10. So the thing with the plates, we've heard him say in other episodes that, did you put your plates back in the replicator? So that would imply there is no dishwashing, that the plates are replicated for the use of when it's time to make dinner, and then they're put back in the replicator to be dissolved again once you're finished using them. Now, as why they're setting the table, maybe they decided to replicate the plates ahead of time, and then once they're done, they'll put them back in the replicator. Or let me throw this possibility out. Perhaps the replicator simply cleans them. And rather than having a dishwasher, if maybe they do have their own plates, but they just put it in the replicator, and the replicator dissolves all the food and makes them sparkly clean just from simply going voot, which would be more in line with this futuristic technology rather than having to wash dishes. But because after all, they have sonic showers now. But anyway, I never got the sonic shower thing. That doesn't really make any sense to me. But as far as Janeway, like, cooking over the replicator, what you have to realize is that not all the writers are consistent with how this futuristic technology works, and sometimes they sacrifice this kind of futuristic consistency in order to be more relatable to modern day audiences. And that's all that fucking shit was. So to me, that's the outlier. But anywho, I always love your comments, Antares, when you point out all these nitpicks about 21st century technology. I love it. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, a decent episode. I mainly like this episode due to the return of Garak and Gul Dukat, whom we haven't seen in a while. I did like the story overall, but I strongly disagreed on how they resolved the situation with the Cardassian boy. I wouldn't be surprised if he committed suicide shortly after this. I think that he should have stayed with his Bajoran foster parents and not with his biological Cardassian family, kind of like Ichab's biological parents were willing to kill him for their planet, whereas he had a real family with Voyager in 7 of 9, in particular whom she was like a surrogate mother to him. So my rating is a 7 out of 10. Yeah, totally agree. He did 100%. He probably committed suicide shortly after. Sisko made the wrong decision flat out. I think it's even worse than the Ichab chase, because I mean, yeah, his I don't think his Cardassian father is going to kill him the way Ichab's parents were going to kill him. But in that case, it was less obvious. Like, Ichab didn't really go to his parents, but it was more of like trepidation. It was more of, in that case, his parents were more caring, more loving, and it seemed like more of a, I don't know, it just seemed right until they found out they actually don't love him. They just want to use him as a weapon. So that was more of like a surprise. I could actually understand Janeway's decision to send Ichab home more than I understand Sisko's decision to send Rugal to Cardassia. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neil Howells that says, Garak is back. Hooray. Let the witty banter commence. Why is there no counselor on DS9 to talk with Rugal? Why is Rugal given into the custody of Keiko the Clueless, who automatically assumes that because Rugal's Cardassian by birth that he would want to eat Cardassian food, even though he has been raised on Bajoran, raised as Bajoran on Bajor for the last 8 years. I do enjoy Miles and Rugal having an unspoken agreement about Cardassian cuisine. It's so beautifully shot. I'm not sure I buy the fact that Dukat arranged Rugal's disappearance to discredit the boy's father. That seems too much of a stretch to me. Why does Sisko never ask Rugal what he wants to do? It sits very badly with me that Rugal has to go back to Cardassia with the father he barely remembers, and suddenly human. I think the right choice was made. This episode is the first time the Cardassian name Terok Nor for Deep Space Nine is used. Like Garak, I believe in coincidences. A lot of coincidences have occurred in my life and still do, but I don't trust coincidences. 7, Cisco's saying, "Don't apologize. It's been the high point of my day. Don't do it again." Out of 10. Yeah, no, that's an excellent Cisco line. The reason why several of the Patreon's supporters brought it up, and I brought it up, because it's an amazing line. Now, and also speaking of amazing lines, Garak has a lot of great lines in this episode as well. Brandon pointed out one I kind of forgot about, which is a classic Garak line of, "I believe in coincidences. Coincidences happen every day, but I don't trust coincidences." Like that. Again, he's so good. Has so many good lines. Anyway, thank you, patrons, so much for your comments. So my rating for Cardassians out of 10 is going to be a 7. Very good. You know what? I was really on the fence of giving between a 7 and an 8 for this episode. When I think of like Garak's amazing lines, his camaraderie with Bashir and the interactions that they have, and also Gul Dukat and his appearance and sort of fleshing out his slimy character, it makes me want to give it an 8. But then when I think of the very bad decision they made, that Cisco just forced this kid who was raised as a Bajoran, who despises Cardassian, forced him back to Cardassia, that makes me want to give it a 7. And I think that wins out. Because also, on top of that, I don't know. I just didn't find, other than the great Garak moments and the great Dukat moments, I didn't find the plot of this episode all that interesting. The way it unfolded, about what, Rugal and all that, I don't know. And, the scene where they had the Cardassian children said, "Have you come to take us back to Cardassia?" is heartbreaking, but they don't follow up on this. Like, we never learn what happens to these children. And so it kind of feels, and I don't think they do enough in this episode, because the episode is more focused on Rugal and Dukat and political stuff. And I don't think it explores that topic sufficiently. And on top of that, the whole Cardassian, setting up all the Cardassian politicking and deceit and everything, which is good, but it's kind of, that doesn't really go anywhere either. That's kind of just shows how despicable they are. And this, father guy is like, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll help those orphans." Like, it makes you say, like, fuck that guy and fuck Dukat and fuck all of them. Who cares about any of them? And so that kind of makes me a bit more apathetic about the plot. So I'll give it a 7. And it is still a good episode, mind you. 7 is still a good rating. And the Dukat and the Garak stuff was amazing, and the Bashir stuff and the Cisco lines. Would one runabout be enough, or would you like 2? Like, that all stuff was great. But when I think of great Dukat and Garak episodes, there's all the ones coming, even some coming later in this season, are really the ones I would think of. I don't think of this one. This is kind of where it began. It's like the origin story for the writers of them really developing Dukat and Garak. But they'll improve. It will get a lot better going down the line. So yeah, I think this one gets a 7. Anyway, that is it for my review of Cardassians. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like. Comment down below. Should this episode have actually gotten an 8? Am I wrong for giving it a 7? Let me know what you think. And if you really would like to support my channel, you can support me on Patreon. There'll be a link to that in the description below. There's different tiers for different budgets, different kinds of rewards. I do Patreon only videos, a series where I revisit reviews that I've already done, and I also have pre-releases, and you can request releases, different rewards for different tiers, so you can check that out. But if you're unable to support me on Patreon, still, if you're able to leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff really helps, and I'm really grateful to everyone for all of that as well. So, let's see what's coming up next on my channel. Let's see, where are we? Cardassians. Okay, so Monday will be my review for Melora. Wednesday will be my review going back to TNG for Dark Page. Thursday I'll be covering Season 5, Episode 4 of Star Trek Lower Decks. And then Saturday, sticking with TNG for my review for Attached. So that is what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to continue to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Next Generation and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.